It started long before Putin was briefed. In the middle of the night, people in Kursk woke up to the sound of distant thuds, then a single sharp blast that shook windows and set off car alarms. Within minutes, the sky over the outskirts of the city glowed orange as fuel depots and ammunition storage points went up in flames. Sirens began to wail, social media filled with shaky phone videos of columns of smoke, and residents who had been told for 2 years that the war was far away suddenly watched it light up their own horizon. By the time the first situation reports reached Moscow, one fact was impossible to disguise. Ukraine had struck deep into the Kursk defensive line, a region Russia has long treated as an untouchable buffer zone, a place that for 2 years Russian officials described with a level of confidence bordering on arrogance, insisting that nothing can break through. For Putin, what happened that night was one of the moments any authoritarian leader fears most, the moment when reality normally wrapped in propaganda, editing, selective reporting, and countless what the boss wants to hear briefings suddenly slams directly into his face, unannounced and without warning. What made the strike on Kursk such a devastating blow to the Kremlin wasn't just that Ukraine unexpectedly penetrated deep into Russian territory, but that it shattered the entire narrative. Moscow has repeated for 2 years that Russia is fighting in Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from attacking Russia. Yes, that has always been the official line. Russia as the defender, Ukraine as the aggressor. But for the propaganda writers, this attack dissolved that storyline faster than Putin's patience dissolves when he hears an honest report. The moment Russia's air defense failed to detect the UAVs or the Ukrainian special forces crossing into the area, Russians began asking the one question the government has no answer for. If Russia is protecting the country, why is the country being attacked? This is not a question Putin can dismiss by calling it a gesture of goodwill the way the Ministry of Defense excused the failures in Kyiv and Kharkiv. Kursk is not a place Russia can deny or spin away. It is Russia's own defensive line, a region the government promised was fully protected, and the very region Putin once used as proof that the war was bringing long-term security. Yet this morning, the people of Kursk looked out their windows and saw that security burning like a spotlight on a theater stage. The irony, of course, is that for months, Russian television has insisted that Ukraine is out of weapons, out of manpower, out of energy, relying entirely on the West. And yet this supposedly exhausted country has just pierced one of Russia's densest defensive lines, and did it in a way the FSB never predicted, the military never intercepted, and the propaganda never explained. Vladimir Solovyov can pound his desk on live TV and call it a provocation, but he, just like Putin, knows full well that in Russia, the word provocation is reserved for anything they fail to stop. And as the Kremlin's silence stretched longer than usual, Russians began doing the one thing the government fears most. They started asking questions. Because in any propaganda system, the most dangerous moment is not when bad news happens, but when people realize previous assurances were nothing more than strips of duct tape slapped onto a dam that had been cracking for years. For months, officials portrayed the Kursk defensive line as impenetrable every meter, guarded by radar, missiles, trenches, artillery, and border troops. But last night, all of it evaporated within hours, and no state broadcast had enough makeup to conceal a failure this visible. The people of Kursk didn't need military analysis. They just needed to look up and see the sky glowing with fire. For Putin, this moment must feel uncomfortably familiar. He lived through it when the assault on Kyiv collapsed, when Kharkiv fell in days, when Kherson was abandoned in what state media politely called a tactical relocation. But Kursk is different. This is not Ukraine's battlefield, where the Kremlin can spin reality with polite phrases like gesture of goodwill, strategic repositioning, or planned withdrawal. This is Russia. This is the place citizens were assured hundreds of times that the war would never, under any circumstances, reach. And then, in a single night, Putin's greatest narrative, that the war keeps Russia safe, was ripped apart at the foundation. Instead of addressing the real issue, Russia's propaganda apparatus immediately slipped into ceremonial denial. One TV host hurriedly declared that Ukraine did not penetrate the defensive line, even though footage from the scene showed otherwise so clear that even a blind person could feel the blast. A Ministry of Defense spokesman insisted that all attacks were repelled, just minutes before social media flooded with videos of Russian armored vehicles burning on Russian soil. Meanwhile, pro-government bloggers faced the impossible task of convincing the public that Ukraine didn't really strike deep into Kursk, but merely got lost, as if armed groups can accidentally pass dozens of defense layers and coincidentally trigger explosions large enough to reboot military radar systems. What made the strike on Kursk such a devastating blow to the Kremlin wasn't just that Ukraine unexpectedly penetrated deep into Russian territory, but that it shattered the entire narrative. Moscow has repeated for 2 years that Russia is fighting in Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from attacking Russia. Yes, that has always been the official line. Russia as the defender, Ukraine as the aggressor. But for the propaganda writers, this attack dissolved that storyline faster than Putin's patience dissolves when he hears an honest report. The moment Russia's air defense failed to detect the UAVs or the Ukrainian special forces crossing into the area, Russians began asking the one question the government has no answer for. If Russia is protecting the country, why is the country being attacked? Russia's security agencies immediately began assigning blame. Some blamed missing radar coverage, others blamed the weather, still others blamed advanced Western technology. All these excuses shared one thing in common. None dared say the failure occurred because the defense system simply didn't work as advertised. No one wants to be the first to say the defensive line failed, because in Russia, the bearer of bad news is often treated like the cause of the bad news. But no matter how they twist the story, the truth stands in front of them. One of the strongest defensive belts in Russia was breached so quickly, the people of Kursk barely had time to wake up. And this is where political irony reaches its peak. While Russian TV tries to reassure citizens that the situation is fully under control, the people on the ground get a first-hand lesson that requires no interpretation. If Ukraine can strike Kursk today, what does that mean for Belgorod, Bryansk, or even Moscow? A government can justify a military failure abroad, but it cannot justify a failure happening on its own soil. And that is why this attack is a political event even larger than it is a military one. At this point, the most bitter truth for the Kremlin is not the explosions in Kursk, but the collapse of the narrative they've repeated for 2 years. This idea that the war is being fought to protect Russians from Ukrainian attacks, now disproven by the simple fact that Ukraine can, in fact, attack Russia. With that realization, the massive propaganda structure Putin built over decades begins to show cracks. People who once believed in imminent victory now see defenses collapsing, supply depots burning, and Russian troops retreating. Even the most pro-war voices must confront the dangerous question. If the war was supposed to stop Ukraine from hitting Russia, then why is Ukraine hitting Russia? This is when official propagandists begin twisting the story with creative acrobatics only possible in a system where truth is treated like contraband. One TV host argued the attack proves Russia is winning because apparently Ukraine striking Russian territory is a sign of Ukrainian desperation. Another insisted it was a strategic trap designed by Russia. And inevitably, someone claimed it was a Western information operation, as if the people of Kursk were hallucinating the explosions outside their own homes. Putin understands the political consequences better than anyone. His entire power structure is built on the promise that only he can keep Russia stable, protected, and safe. But now he faces the uncomfortable truth that the threat isn't coming from outside, it's coming from the failure of the system he built. Ukraine didn't need to seize Kursk to send a message. Destroying the defensive line was enough to make Russians question Putin's promises. And once one promise is questioned, Every promise becomes fragile. Russian officials understand this, and their reaction betrays the anxiety they try so hard to hide. Internally, they now face questions no one wants to answer. Why did one of the country's most fortified lines collapse without warning? Some internal reports blame poor coordination between the FSB, Ministry of Defense, and border forces. Others blame overloaded surveillance systems, but all avoid the core issue. The system is designed to reward people who report what leaders want to hear, not what is real. No one wants to be the first to say the defensive line didn't work, because in Russia, the bearer of bad news is often punished harder than the cause of the bad news. In its effort to control public opinion, the Kremlin announced that everything is going according to plan. But the obvious question is, what plan? No military strategy involves letting the enemy advance into your territory undetected. No defensive doctrine lists the loss of supply depots or critical positions as expected phases. And no country would willingly allow the enemy to destroy infrastructure on its own soil just to create a storyline for state TV. Yet this is exactly what the propaganda machine wants Russians to believe, that defeat is strategy, surprise is strength, and silence is control. But when videos of Kursk burning spread faster than official statements, that narrative collapses into absurdity. The dark irony is that what Ukraine did in Kursk is essentially what Putin tried to do in Ukraine in 2014, shatter the sense of security. When Putin seized Crimea, the goal was not just territorial, it was psychological, to make Ukrainians feel that everything could change overnight. Now Ukraine is using that same tactic, but the target is Russia. And the Kremlin has no defense against psychological warfare that unfolds outside its control. It cannot simply ban social media, cannot block every video, cannot convince citizens that what they saw with their own eyes was fabricated by the West. And in the end, looking back at everything that unfolded in Kursk, even the Kremlin can't deny the obvious. This attack didn't just destroy a defensive line, it destroyed the illusion that Russia can control everything with propaganda. Reality outran the scripted narrative, and for the first time in 2 years, Russians saw something the government tried desperately to hide. The war is no longer far away. The war is knocking at the door. The question now is not why Ukraine pulled it off, but how long Russia can keep hiding the truth. And if Kursk is only the beginning, then the war Putin believes he controls may be entering a phase where he